In 2015, researchers at the University of Chicago found that chronic loneliness produces changes in gene expression in social mammals. Not mood changes, not behavioral changes, gene expression. The DNA inside the cells of a lonely animal begins reading differently. Immune function drops. Inflammatory response increases. The body starts preparing for a threat that isn't there. Because for 200 million years of mammalian evolution, being alone meant one thing. Something had gone badly wrong. Most people think of loneliness as an emotion, a feeling that arrives when you'd prefer company. Something that passes. The research suggests it is something considerably older and considerably less optional than that. Loneliness, in the animals built to experience it, is not a mood. It is a biological alarm system, one that was calibrated long before the species that now uses the word for it ever existed. And when that alarm fires in the wrong conditions, when the isolation is sustained, when no group returns, the consequences are not emotional. They are physical, cellular, measurable in the blood, start with why the system exists at all. Social mammals didn't evolve to live alone. The group was the survival unit for wolves, for elephants, for primates, for the ancestors of every domesticated animal that now sleeps in a house. The individual outside the group was the individual most likely to die. Predation risk multiplied. Thermoregulation dropped. Access to food, to mates, to protection, all of it contingent on membership. The body needed a way to detect when membership was at risk, to flag the condition before it became fatal. The alarm it built for this purpose is the same one that fires when you haven't spoken to another person in 3 days and something starts to feel wrong in a way you can't name. The mechanism is identical. The evolutionary origin is shared. What you call loneliness, your body calls a survival emergency that has been running since before your species had language to describe it. The 2015 University of Chicago study, led by neuroscientist John Cacioppo, was not primarily about animals. It was a landmark study of loneliness across species that revealed something the field had not anticipated. When socially isolated mammals were compared to socially connected ones, the differences weren't limited to behavior or stress hormone levels. The isolated animals showed altered expression in genes linked to immune function, specifically in the pathways governing inflammation and antiviral response. The body was shifting its biological priorities, pulling resources away from long-term health maintenance and redirecting them toward immediate threat response. Because at the cellular level, being alone registered as being under attack. The body couldn't distinguish between social isolation and physical danger. It responded to both the same way. With everything it had, in wolves, the behavioral signature of this alarm is documented and precise. Research tracking lone wolves in Yellowstone and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem found that wolves separated from their packs showed increased movement patterns, covering significantly more ground than pack members over equivalent time periods, not hunting movements. Searching movements. The lone wolf wasn't patrolling territory. It was running a location search for something it couldn't find. Cortisol levels in lone wolves were consistently elevated above pack members regardless of food availability or environmental threat. The body was treating absence as danger even when no external danger was present. The alarm was running without anything to shut it off. Elephants provide the clearest behavioral window into what sustained isolation does to a social animal over time. In 2012, researchers in Zimbabwe documented a bull elephant separated from his natal group following a culling operation that had reduced the local population. He was physically healthy. Territory was adequate. Food and water were available. By every survival metric, his situation was manageable. What the researchers documented over 14 months was a behavioral deterioration that didn't map onto any standard category. Increased aggression toward other species including humans, repetitive movement patterns along fixed routes with no apparent foraging or survival function, and a specific behavior the researchers noted repeatedly. The elephant returning to a ridge overlooking the valley his group had last been seen in, standing there, facing that direction, for periods that served no survival purpose, just standing, just facing. The researchers were careful about what they called it. The field is always careful, but the elephant's behavior matched a pattern documented across multiple isolated elephants in multiple studies. The body oriented toward the absent group long after the group was gone. The alarm running with nothing to turn it off. Here is the part that changes how you understand what the alarm actually is. In 2008, John Cacioppo and colleagues demonstrated that loneliness in social mammals produces hypervigilance, a measurable increase in threat detection sensitivity. Lonely animals don't just feel worse. They perceive the world differently. They detect threats faster, respond more intensely to ambiguous stimuli, and categorize neutral situations as dangerous more frequently than socially connected animals. The isolation doesn't just make them sad in the way the word implies. It changes the lens through which they process everything around them. A lone animal in a world full of neutral events begins reading those events as hostile, not because the world changed, because the alarm running inside it changed what neutral looks like. This is the evolutionary logic. An animal without the group is genuinely more vulnerable. Heightened threat detection makes sense when you're actually alone in a dangerous world. The problem is that the system doesn't know the difference between productive solitude and damaging isolation. It doesn't know the difference between an animal that chose to be alone temporarily and one that has been separated permanently. It just runs the alarm. And the longer the alarm runs, the more it reshapes the animal running it. In primates, the research on social isolation is the most extensive and the most difficult to read. Studies of rhesus macaques raised in isolation through early development, research conducted from the 1950s through the 1980s by Harry Harlow and subsequent researchers, documented behavioral outcomes that permanently altered how the field understood the relationship between social connection and neurological development. Isolated macaques showed stereotypic behaviors, self-directed aggression, and an inability to form normal social bonds even when later reintegrated into groups. The isolation hadn't just made them lonely. It had changed the structure of how their brains processed social information. The alarm had run so long in a developing brain that it had rewritten the architecture. The animal that came out the other side was not the same animal that would have developed with normal social contact. Loneliness, sustained long enough and early enough, doesn't just feel like damage. It produces it. The question the research keeps circling without fully entering is what any of this is like from the inside. The gene expression data tells us what the cells are doing. The cortisol curves tell us what the stress system is doing. The behavioral documentation tells us what the body is doing in response. What it cannot reach is the interior of those 14 months the Zimbabwean elephant spent standing on a ridge facing a valley where his group used to be. Whether the standing meant something to him the way it would mean something to you. Whether there was something it was like to be that animal, oriented toward an absence, with an alarm inside him that had no way to know it was pointing at something that wasn't coming back. The researchers who study this most carefully don't close that question. The cellular data is settled. The behavioral signatures are documented. The evolutionary logic is coherent. What the science has built is a precise and thorough account of the mechanism. What it has not built, and may not be able to build, is an account of the experience. Whether the alarm that reshapes gene expression and drives a lone wolf across 100 miles of territory and keeps an elephant standing on a ridge for 14 months. Whether any of that is accompanied by something. Whether there is a felt quality to it. Whether the word we use for ourselves, when we use it honestly, is the same word. The body that built the alarm didn't build it for elephants or wolves or the rhesus macaque. It built it for something much older than any of them. A biological signal old enough that every social species on the planet inherited a version of it. Old enough that the cellular response it produces is nearly identical across species separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolution. The alarm is the same. The animal running it is different. Whether what it feels like is also the same is the part the data leaves open. And standing at that open question, looking at a lone elephant on a ridge facing the wrong direction, it is very hard to argue confidently that it isn't.